welcome. Really my pleasure to have you join me this afternoon at this session organized by the Institute. We have the honor of having with us Dr. Martin Indek. Martin is the Vice President and Director of the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. Previously, he founded the Savant Center at Brookings, and he's also a Brookings Senior Fellow. He served in the U.S. administration. He was an ambassador to Israel twice. Before that, he was a special assistant to President Bill Clinton, and also Senior Director for the Near East and South Asia at the NSC. He was also Assistant Secretary of State for the Near East from 1997 to 2000. He actually comes from Australia originally, and he has a Bachelor's in Economics from Sydney and a PhD in International Relations from the ANU. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Dr. Martin Indek.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Since only the Kuwaiti ambassador has his coat on, I'll ask dispensation to take mine off. And now I can give you approval to take yours off. Good afternoon. I'm very glad to have the opportunity to speak at the Middle East Institute here in Singapore. I actually have, in my lifetime, set up two Middle East institutes, one within the Brookings Institute, another freestanding. So I'm very glad to see that Singapore is engaged in this effort to, as the chairman reminded me, he came to see me a few years back when first setting up the institute. So I'm very glad to see that it's now established and building its position here in Singapore. Couldn't be more timely in terms of what's happening in the Arab world and the way in which it is not only focusing the attention of the world on dramatic revolutionary developments that are taking place there. But it's also very important in terms of the potential it can have for good and for worse in terms of the developments there. And so I wanted to speak today about the causes and the nature of the change that is sweeping the Arab world, where we can expect it to go, and what are its implications for the region, for the world, and end up with the implications for American policy. The first point I would like to make, and really is the heart of what I have to say, is that what is happening here is a profound development. It is like a political tsunami that will wash up on every shore in the Arab world, for reasons I will explain. We can already see the implications in terms of the spike in the price of oil, and the way that is reverberating in terms of impacting the global economy, where I come, in fact, on the economic recovery of the United States. I don't know if that's me. Somebody else is fine. It's not me. Imagine if the troubles that have taken place in Bahrain erupt again and spread across the causeway into Saudi Arabia. What that could do to the price of oil and what that could do to the global economy. If Jordan instability in Jordan turns that country into a launching pad for attacks on Israel, or if a blow-up in Gaza generates a dynamic that leads the Israeli army to move back into Gaza, the Egyptian army facing popular demands from the Egyptian street, acts in a way that could lead to the abrogation of Israeli-Egypt history. And add to this volatile mix an Iran that manages to acquire nuclear capabilities while everybody else is preoccupied with what's happening. Already there is a major rift in relations between the United States and Saudi Arabia. There are major doubts about America's ability to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There's reason for real concern about what will happen after American forces complete their withdrawal from Iraq this year. And so one can imagine a kind of cascade of developments that bode ill for stability in a volatile region. And its impact could then be felt all around the world, including even here in the Well, that's the glass half empty. There is a glass half full. I'm a glass half full kind of guy, so I prefer the more optimistic scenarios. The most important, I think, is that the Arab people are redeeming their dignity through asserting their demands for universal rights, political accountability of their governments, freedom of expression, association, organisation. And if they succeed in building governments that are more accountable to their people, those states will be more stable over time and more committed to pursuing peaceful relations with their neighbours and with the world. And that, given the volatility of the region, I think can be a very positive development over time. But we really are at the beginning of this process, and we really don't know where it's going. It's uncharted waters. I mean, we've seen revolutions take place in other parts of the world. We can draw some lessons from what's happened in Eastern Europe, Latin America. But the Middle East and the Arab world has its own unique characteristics, and we've never seen anything like this before. And so it's very hard to predict what the course and outcome will be. But let's start at the beginning. Why now? I don't know of anybody who predicted that the revolutions would take place in Tunisia and Egypt at the beginning of this year. If there was somebody who did, they certainly haven't come forward to claim their perspicacity. Now, in a way, that's surprising, because all of the factors that generated this explosion were well known. Those of you who've studied the Middle East would have been aware of the youth bulge. For at least a decade, analysts have been focused on the fact that in every country in the Arab world, over 50% of the people are under the age of 30. And in just about every Arab country, the unemployment rate amongst those people under the age of 30 is around 25%. In a place like Saudi Arabia, with all of its vast oil wealth, it's 27%. And that, combined with, in many cases in the Arab world, authoritarian regimes that had systematically failed over prolonged periods of time to meet the needs of their people, basic needs of their people, created circumstances in which, at some point, something was going to have to give. And when you combine that with the advent, again, a decade ago, of cable news in Arabic, what's known as the Al Jazeera phenomenon, but it's not just Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, NBC, so Arabic, 24/7, satellite cable television program that beams into just about every home in every Arab country. News about what's going on in the rest of the Arab world, creating an Arab community across borders that was not controllable by governments. And then you have the internet with the social networking and connectivity that came from that, which enabled these same young people to start to talk to each other and to start to organise, again, in ways that their authoritarian governments have no means of controlling. So I think that the combination of those circumstances created a situation where, sooner or later, there was going to be mass popular protest. There were several other factors. The regimes that had been in power for decades, in the case of the Mubarak regime, an increasingly sclerotic regime. In the case of both Egypt and Tunisia, regimes that had become not just corrupt, but the kleptocracy had become narrower and narrower in terms of the family and those associates of the family of the ruling figures, Ben Ali and Mubarak, being the ones to benefit most from globalization and the way in which Egypt and Tunisia were able to plug into that phenomenon to grow their economies. But with the growth came this incredible disparity between the very few associated with government, with the ruling family, and the many. And there was one other ingredient, I think, which was critically important. And that was the balance of fear, the psychology of the revolt. I actually think that this first registered in the minds of people across the Arab world when they saw how quickly Saddam Hussein's regime crumbled in the face of American invading army. That was a big revelation to people, that what appeared to be this almighty, powerful regime that had struck fear in the minds and hearts of all Iraqi people could just disappear overnight. And of course, I think Arabs pulled back in horror at the chaos that then followed. And so it didn't translate into a feeling that at that point that their leaders were leaders with feet of clay. But when it happened in Tunisia, when this fruit seller in a village that nobody else had ever heard of set himself on fire because of the injustice and repression of the Tunisian security services, and people came out to demonstrate. And within a few days, the regime was gone. That had a powerful impact. And I think, I can't remember, I think people tied it back in their minds to what happened with the Saddam Hussein regime. If these feared regimes could simply disappear like that, it changed the balance of fear in the minds of the people. And that's what created the circumstances in which Egyptian young people, already having organized protest movements, and now connected through the internet and their social networks, understanding that peaceful, non-violent protest was a critical tactic for the success of their efforts, then poured out into the streets of Cairo and Alexandria. The revolution in Tunisia was important because it sparked the revolution in Egypt, but the revolution in Egypt is profoundly important in terms of the next question, which is where it goes next. Because Egypt is the largest, militarily most powerful, culturally most important country in the Arab world. 1 in every 4 Arabs is an Egyptian. And its central location in the heart of the Middle East, combined with those other factors, gives it an importance far beyond any other Arab country. And so that's why I say the revolution took place in Egypt to create a kind of political tsunami. And we saw how it spread all the way across to Yemen, Morocco, Algeria. About that time, the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal, which he said, what happened in Syria? Very cockily, well, guess what? A month later, happened in Syria. Today, you see the most horrendous violence on the part of a regime that has lost its legitimacy with its people. Regime, in an effort to suppress these demonstrations, is finding itself increasingly isolated and unable to do so. But I'll come back to that in a moment. In the Gulf, Bahrain, we saw major demonstrations with 1/5 of the population, 1/5 of the population in the streets of Bahrain, prolonged demonstrations over several months. So I think that the first point I would like to make is that because of the way in which it's developed, it is very hard to see how this is going to affect every country in the Arab world. There are very few that are left that haven't suffered the major demonstrations. And the notion that those that now have quietened down have dodged the bullet and will not face the demands from their people for more accountable government is an illusion. I would say a dangerous illusion. Where next? Well, as I said, it started in Tunisia, spread to Yemen, Bahrain, Algeria, Morocco, and Libya, and thence to Syria. There have been demonstrations in Jordan as well. What we see here is basically three cases, three types of change that's taken place. The first is where the revolutions have already taken place. That's Egypt and Tunisia. There, you have countries which are now going through the very difficult and unpredictable transition to democracies. Not clear that they'll actually make it. We've seen in other places, most recently in Iran, with the revolution that took place there in the 1970s, that revolutions that may start out as secular can easily get hijacked. And that could happen in these cases too. The best organized and organizations which have perhaps the best purchase on the minds of the more general public, most of whom were not involved in the actual revolution itself. That's the Muslim Brotherhood in both Tunisia and Egypt. With the advent of early elections, they have the best chance of gaining support because they've got organizations and an ideology that resonates more broadly with people. The secular revolutionaries have a very big challenge in turning from street politics to organized party politics that will enable them to get out the vote and gain seats in the legislatures, or in the case of Tunisia, in the Constitutional Assembly that will determine the shape of the political system. By the way, it's interesting, I don't know how many of you know, that in Tunisia they have resolved that the split between women and men for the Constitutional Assembly will be 50-50, which is something in itself that's quite revolutionary. We don't have that in the United States. I'm sure you don't have it in Singapore either. That challenge of organising politically now is a very big one for secular revolutions. I think at last count there are 35 political parties preparing to contest the elections in September in Egypt. And that is the way it normally goes with democratic transitions. If you've been out in the street and you've overthrown the regime, you feel that the people are with you. And therefore, why shouldn't you have your own party as well? But it mitigates against the formation of strong governments capable of meeting the needs of their people who have been neglected for so long. And so the governments that are formed as a result of these elections are likely to be weak coalition governments. That will be heavily challenged in terms of their ability to meet the very high expectations of their people. After all, what sparked the revolutions was economic deprivation, was the lack of decent jobs, housing. And yet the revolutions themselves have crippled the economies of Tunisia and Egypt. There's been capital flight, there's no foreign direct investment. Capital, as you know, is a coward when it comes to these kinds of revolutionary situations. There's not good security in the streets. Therefore, tourists have stopped coming. These economies are in serious trouble. So the governments that take over, they're going to be heavily challenged in terms of being able to meet the raised expectations of their people. After all, it's a new government, a new day. Where's our jobs? The Muslim Brotherhood, I think, intends to play the long game. They don't want to take government at the beginning. Partly because I think they understand that they won't be able to meet the needs and expectations of people. Partly because they've seen before in Algeria and in the Palestinian elections that when they won the elections and took the government, they found themselves isolated, rejected, suppressed, in the case of the Algerian army. And they don't want to go through that. Much better from their point of view to declare, as they have, that they don't want to take the government, to restrict the number of candidates that they will run so that they won't achieve a majority, and to wait for the secular parties to fail, in which case later on they'll be able to stand up and say, we should try our alternative. We can do it in a way that the secular parties cannot. So that seems to be their calculation, and therefore I think the secular parties will have a chance to try to meet the expectations of people, and as I said, it will be very difficult. We'll see. Already you see the international community, particularly the United States and Europe, the Western democracies, mobilizing now to try to ensure that the resources will flow to newly elected governments. At the same time, you see organizations from countries that have gone through revolutions, whether it's from Poland or from Chile, coming in and helping these secular parties organize within. So it's by no means certain that these parties will fail, but they will certainly have a difficult job. In both Egypt and Tunisia, but much more so in Egypt, the military, the army, is playing an important role as kind of midwives of this transition. Some people are kind of cynical about this and say what's really happening is that the military are taking over. But I don't think that is in fact the case. Neither in Egypt or Tunisia does the military actually want to be the government. They seem to want to get out of the way of politics as quickly as possible. I have a friend in Cairo who says that you can tell what day of the week it is by turning on the radio when he gets up in the morning. If the opposition, the revolution, youth are making demands, it must be Monday. And if the military are rejecting the demands, it must be Tuesday. And if the youth are declaring that there's going to be a demonstration on Friday, then it must be Wednesday. And if the military council announces that they've capitulated to the demands of the demonstrators, then it must be Thursday. And that is the pattern. For instance, Mubarak, the military promised Mubarak that he would not be prosecuted. It was part of the deal. He's being prosecuted. And he may well be executed because of the demands of the people, not because of the political laws. they do have a very real interest in national security affairs and a very real interest in protecting their own purposes. And that's what they will do. In the national security arena, they have no interest in Egypt. The military has no interest in going back to war with Israel. And so, you know, the foreign ministry can declare that Rafah is going to be opened up, the border between Gaza and Egypt. But the military have made sure that no males between the age of 18 and 40 can cross into Egypt without a visa. And good luck with those visas. They have an intense interest in preventing a blow-up in Gaza that could bring the Israeli army back into Gaza and lead to demands of a popularly elected Egyptian parliament to abrogate the peace treaty with Israel and go back to war. That's very likely to happen in the newly elected Egyptian parliament. But the consequences for the military is, number one, they'll lose their $1.3 billion a year in military assistance from the United States. Number two, they'll lose all of their military equipment and spare parts. It's an entirely American-equipped army. And number three, they go back to war, they'll lose. They're not ready to fight a war with Israel. More importantly than all of that, the border with Israel is the least of their problems. They've got problems with Libya, they've got problems with the Sudan, they've got problems with Ethiopia, the headwaters of the Nile. The last thing they want is conflict with Israel. And so you will see them, I believe, operating to ensure that this process does not get out of hand. Now, it still could. One could well imagine that if the Palestinians were to launch their own freedom movement that was peaceful and non-violent, with thousands of people demonstrating in the West Bank, and some incident occurs, and the Israeli military opens fire, and that can spark major protests in Egypt. Yeah, the popular elected Egyptian parliament could introduce legislation to abrogate the treaty. So it's not exactly completely under the control of the Egyptian military, but to the extent that they have an interest here, it is an interest in maintaining stability. And the fact that the army stayed out of the revolution, in fact, told Mubarak that he had to go, has left the army in a position to protect the national interests of the state. Tunisia, the military is much smaller and less influential, but they're more or less playing a similar role. The second basket of countries are those that are now going through the revolutionary stage. That's Libya, Yemen, and Syria. The circumstances are a bit different in each case, but what you have is a regime determined to cling to power, relying on tribal or sectarian base of support, and fighting it out in the streets. We see that very clearly in all three cases. In Syria, it's more sectarian based because you have an Alawite minority regime that has ruled for many decades over a Sunni majority of the population. The Sunnis are something like 75% of the public population in the Syrians. In Libya and Yemen, it's far more tribal in terms of the base of support that the regime can rely on. But Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen is already gone. He's out of the country. He hasn't resigned yet, but I think it's under a matter of time before what's left of his regime and the opposition parties and tribal leaders come together and work out an arrangement. In Libya, it's a similar situation. Time is working against Gaddafi and in favour of the opposition. That's because NATO bombing is systematically degrading Gaddafi's military capabilities. Because the embargo and sanctions prevent Gaddafi from selling any oil. And because his assets are all frozen around the world. So his ability to survive, to pay his mercenaries, to maintain the allegiance of his people is going down over time, fairly dramatically. And the opposition, based in Benghazi, now spreading west through the battle in Misrata and through the battles in the mountains to the west of Tripoli, is gaining in strength, gaining in capabilities, being armed, trained for the assault on Tripoli, and slowly but surely gaining recognition and financial support from the international community as well. So it's very clear where the way that the balance is shifting, and I think it's maybe weeks, maybe months, but not more than that before Gaddafi would go. Syria, I suspect, will take a lot longer, and a lot more people will die, unfortunately. What's interesting in Syria is the contrast between the way that the protest movement is unfolding with the way it unfolded in Egypt. In Egypt, you saw the action all focused on Tahrir Square, the main square of the country, and the ability of the opposition to bring out hundreds, thousands of people was what made all the difference, together with the fact that the army was clear to open fire. In Syria, that hasn't been possible. You don't see major demonstrations in the capital city, Damascus. You see very few demonstrations there at all, except in the outer-lying suburbs. That's for two reasons. Number one, the security services have the place clamped shut. But number two, the Sunni business elites that are based in Damascus and Aleppo to the north have not yet split with the regime. And so the people of these two major cities have not yet decided to break with the regime and come out into the streets. So in contrast to what you have in Egypt, in Syria, you have it popping up in the outer-lying places. And it's really quite extraordinary the way that this is spreading. We have a game in the arcades in the United States, I don't know what you have in here, it's called whack-a-mole. We have these little moles that come out of holes, and you have a big sledgehammer and whack them down, and you whack one down, and another one comes up over here. And that's essentially what's happening in Syria. The opposition is very well connected and means of communication. Even though the media has been blocked from coming into the country, reporting from the country, every day there's film footage coming out, video footage coming out from the demonstrations taking place all over the country. And what you see is another phenomenon that's creating a real problem for the regime, which is that the major revolts are taking place on the borders. Started in Dara in the south, the border with Jordan, then spread to Latakia in the west on the border with Lebanon, then to the north in Jazr al-Shagur, where the fighting has been taking place and where the refugees are moving, of course, into Turkey now. And lo and behold, in the last couple of days, it spread to the east, to the border with Iraq, where Syria's Kurds are concentrated. And that's a real problem for the regime. It's why they're responding with such brutal force, sending the tanks. Because what they fear most is safe havens that are created on the border that can be fueled and supported from these other countries that border Syria, in a way that then makes it much harder for the regime to suppress the revolts. In Iraq, there is a real desire to give back to the Syrians what they did to the Iraqis, in terms of encouraging the flow of insurgents into Iraq across the Syrian border that killed so many Iraqi people. In Turkey, the government had allied itself with Syria. This was part of Turkey's big breakthrough into the Arab world. But now the Prime Minister has broken with Assad, condemned his actions. And with all these thousands of refugees coming across the border, the Turkish government is warning Syria that they will move into Syria to create a safe haven inside Syria for these refugees. And if they do that, we will have the first instance of military intervention in Syria. But it will create a real problem for the Syrian government. And they will have to decide if they're going to take on the Turkish army. I don't think so. Assad is faced with the classic dictator's dilemma at this point. He's promised all manner of reform, but hasn't implemented it. If he starts to implement it now, it will be dismissed as not serious. And the revolutionaries will see that he's weakening, and so they will demand more. If he uses force, which is what he's doing in large measure now, he will only fuel the anger of the people. And you see it, how it's spreading all over the country. And the brutality and thuggishness of a regime that can take a 14-year-old kid and torture him and then return his body to his parents with his genitals cut off. Gives you a sense of what the regime is capable of, right? The outrage that it is now generating against its people. And so, as I said, I think in this case as well, it's only a matter of time before the Sunni business elite breaks with the regime. The longer it goes on, the more economic difficulties Syria will face, and the more those Sunni business elites will come to them. They're better off breaking with the regime. The other critical factor will be the military. And already we've seen, last Thursday, a crack in the military, with officers leaving their troops in the north. And those were Sunni officers. Some of them were shot on the spot by Alawite generals. And this is now fueling a kind of sectarianism that could see the military crack apart as the Sunni break with the Alawites with the military. Our third possibility is that the Alawites will turn against Assad as well. Rather than to go down with him, they will ally with the Sunnis to prevent sectarian warfare from breaking out and basically force it to go. That may be wishful thinking on my part, but it's also possible. So, that's in terms of the countries that are revolutionary state. I confidently predict, parentheses, none of my predictions have ever proven right when it comes to the Middle East, but I confidently predict that all of these regimes will be gone sooner rather than later. So then you've got Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Yemen, Syria. At a certain point, the question is, what is going to happen in the other countries? Particularly what is going to happen in the kingdoms, the sheikh kingdoms, Morocco, Jordan, Oman, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and the big one, the really big one, Saudi Arabia. The kings and sheikhs like to say there's a difference between them and the Republican regimes that have either been overthrown or in the midst of revolution. And there is some truth to that. They have greater religious legitimacy in some cases. Morocco and Saudi Arabia, the ruling families, have connection to the Prophet Muhammad. Saudi Arabia, the custodians of the two holy mosques, Mecca and Medina. That gives them religious legitimacy. Of course, in the case of Saudi Arabia, there is an alliance between the royal family and the Wahhabi clergy. There's also tribal legitimacy. The King of Jordan is Hashemite, has the allegiance, fierce allegiance, I would say, of the Hashemite tribes that represent about 35% of the population. And that's true more or less in the smaller sheikdoms of the Gulf. In many of these places, you have young leaders who have engaged in some measure of reform. Or in the case of Kuwait, you have a raucous, some would say too raucous parliament that was introduced after the liberation of Kuwait from Iraq. And there you have room for political dissent. And of course, the Gulf kingdoms, most of them have a lot of money to spread around. The King of Saudi Arabia has committed $100 billion to improving a lot of the people, to provide 60,000 jobs, 30,000 houses, to buy off any potential dissent. Kuwait, the ambassador will correct me if I've got this wrong, but I think the Emir has promised free food for a year to the public as a way of making sure that there's no deprivation. So that can work for a while. To the extent that this is economically driven revolution, money can buy you love. But to the extent that your citizens are looking at television and watching people in the streets of Cairo demanding their political freedom, to the extent that they say, I want some of that, then there's a problem. We've seen it in particular in Bahrain. Now, Bahrain can be kind of dismissed as a special case where you have a majority Shia population demonstrating against a minority Sunni king. But it's not just about that. and the way in which Saudi Arabia moved in to suppress the demands for political freedom in Bahrain, and to clamp the lid down tight and close off the pressure valves, arrest all of the opposition leaders, prosecute doctors for treating the wounded, is creating a circumstance there where I think sooner rather than later